Originally, I started this video on the supposed horrible treatment of disabled veterans, with their isolation on the island of Valam. But the first article I read on the topic stated that it was nothing but a myth. Not to be discouraged, I continued my research and found that the pieces on Valam Island being a myth were from less credible sources than the articles supporting the idea. But still, I advise you not to take my word as fact, and to come to your own conclusions on this inconclusive topic. I also found that even if I discussed both sides of the argument, this video would be quite short. So, I elaborated the video to encompass general treatment of Soviet veterans after World War II. But now, without further ado, the video. At the start of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Stalin held significant control over his armies. He named himself Supreme Commander-in-Chief, and a majority of the army's movement had to go directly through him. By the time an attack had begun, word reached Stalin and his team, an appropriate response was calculated based on limited knowledge of the land fought over, and that response being delivered and understood by the general. The attack was already finished or in a decisive stage. Due to the front being so massive, this chain of command caused many large encirclements of Soviet troops. These encircled men had a decision between certain death if they continued fighting, or probable death if they gave themselves in as POWs. Although not the only reason for the huge amounts of casualties, I believe it isn't insignificant, and to cover the array of Soviet ineptitudes at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa is a whole other video. It is commonly understood that around 5.7 million Soviets were taken as prisoners of war. But the Germans saw Slavs as subhuman. On top of this, the Soviets fought for communism, and so Germans treated them much worse than any other white Allied soldiers once captured. Just before the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Commissar Order was enacted, stating that any commissars or thoroughly Bolshevized soldiers captured would be executed on the spot. The soldiers who survived this screening would be stripped of most everything they had, leaving them with only thin clothing, and marched to camps, which were basically just fenced-in areas under guard. The luckiest of these prisoners were sent back to the front line to fight alongside German soldiers, and considering how the war turned out for the Nazis, that's saying a lot. It was very likely that these soldiers would be killed in action. Some soldiers were able to flee to Western countries once the war was over, but a majority of surviving soldiers were captured by the USSR, where they'd be imprisoned or killed for treason against the Soviet Union. Many Soviet prisoners of war died due to exposure because of inadequate or no housing during the winter months, and exhaustion by being overworked in the camps, or during their death marches to the camps. So you'd think the soldiers who survived these horrid conditions would be treated as heroes, or even helped in any way. But no, the captured soldiers were seen as traitors to the state, who willingly gave themselves up to the Germans. These men were taken and transported to gulags in Siberia to spend the rest of their lives imprisoned. Right from one camp to another, never being able to see the loved ones they left behind, never being able to experience the freedom that they fought so hard for. Although the First World War and Napoleonic Wars are both known as patriotic wars respectively in Russia, the Great Patriotic War refers to the Second World War for the Soviet Union. In Russia, it is still common to find people calling it the Great Patriotic War today. So, socially, these soldiers who survived the war were seen as heroes and treated as such by the people who they lived with or around. But the few benefits awarded to the veterans by the state were slowly stripped away as the nation couldn't financially afford to continue to reward the millions of veterans. By 1948, 3 years after the war ended, all benefits that were originally given to veterans were entirely revoked. To put it into perspective, the American veterans of the Second World War still receive benefits for their service. Psychological diseases were left fairly unchecked, partially due to lack of knowledge of the disorders and financial shortcomings, but also hospital capacity, as physical injuries, both civilian and military, were in staggeringly high numbers. It was expected by the state that wives and mothers would act as personal therapists and psychological caregivers to soldiers, relinquishing blame from the state for the untreated disorders. Some soldiers had to start their lives anew, as the Germans devastated Soviet towns under occupation, and so, some had their entire families killed. Or, once the family was relocated, were not able to return home. After the war, the Soviet Union as well as most countries went through a period of demobilization, and, in a few years, the army went from 11 million soldiers to 3 million. Now, with 8 million men looking for work, there was little to find, leading to rampant poverty. These factors led to a spike in crime, alcoholism, and alcohol-based deaths, primarily by soldiers who were out of a job due to demobilization and/or had untreated psychological disorders. Quickly, the idea of the heroic soldier coming home from war faded from the social consciousness, and soldiers would soon be, if not frowned upon, then given a bad reputation. Since there was public stigma against disabled people in the Soviet Union, there really aren't public numbers as to how many there were after World War II. But one thing is sure is that the number was above 2.5 million. As a veteran who was physically maimed by the war, it was nearly impossible to find a job, which led to reliance on family to keep the veterans safe and fed. Even then, houses were poor, with poor food quality, which didn't allow for proper recovery of wounds and ailments. And, if the individuals were able to land a job, it was usually physically demanding, and they often had to make long commutes on foot. On top of all this, these physically disabled people were imprisoned by the lack of disability-friendly access to buildings and locations. But, as mentioned before, many soldiers were not able to find their families, and so were forced onto the street to beg. Veterans who had lost limbs were given the nickname Samovar by the public, in reference to the large teapot people said that they resembled. This term came to encompass any disfigured veteran of the war. Moscow's streets were lined with these men, hoping for some loose change from passers-by. This too tainted the image of the veterans in the eyes of the public, and many began a culture of shaming these men for their disfigurement. It was seen by the government how these men were frowned upon, which took away from the glory and pride of the Great Patriotic War, and highlighted its brutality and the reality of many of these soldiers being abandoned by the state. Something had to be done, or else there would be consequences. The Soviet government recognized this as an opportunity to look better in the eyes of their public, and to rid the streets of its unwanted ornaments, and so devised a plan. This plan was to round up the homeless disabled veterans in sanatoriums in northern Russia and Siberia. The Soviets could say that they were taking care of their disabled, and kept them away from the disgusted gaze of the public. The collection of these people took several years, and at first, focused on taking men from major cities like Leningrad, Moscow, and Kyiv, with later waves focusing on more rural areas. These men were assessed on their physical ability, and placed into an according holding center, of which there were two types. One for those still able to work, in some capacity, and the second for those who couldn't. Those who could work were trained for one of a multitude of jobs, so even disabled, the USSR was able to take advantage of their labor. This allowed for some to be rehabilitated and sent back into the workforce. Those who were able to fully rehabilitate were placed on a pedestal in newspapers, and seen as the glory of the Soviet Union manifesting in the willpower to overcome their disabilities. To improve the image of the Soviet Union and its perfection, fictional people were conjured up and celebrated, like Colonel Voropev, who overcame his tuberculosis and surpassed the limitation of his amputated leg to re-enter the workforce. But the reality is that a majority of people were not able to succeed with their disability. It was told to them that their position and inability to rehabilitate was their fault. Those determined not to have a chance or unable to rehabilitate were kept far from the public eye in distant communities and sanatoriums. Slowly, the sentiment grew that these people were social parasites, in that they took more from the system than they put in, which led to many labor colonies being built, or more colloquially known as gulags. The most famous of these being Spasskaya, where thousands of disabled veterans were sent to work to the best of their ability. Here is where we see the rise of the somewhat mythical Valam Sanatorium, where many veterans would reside. We're still unsure of the fate of these people, but considering the general treatment of disabled veterans, I can't imagine it was anything but grim. The veterans were under constant guard to ensure none escaped, and supposedly were given necessary medication and nutrition. But what was necessary in the Soviet Union is unsure, and so these sanatoriums remain shrouded in mystery as to the treatment of their veterans. And that is Soviet Veterans Highlighted.